So at this point, I think it's very critical to understand how to control things in 3D Code as well as how to make selections. If you can't do either one of those, you won't be able to function well at all. So in this case, I want to show you how to rotate your viewport. You can left click on this little curve icon here and drag it to rotate your viewport. The one next to it allows you to move your camera. Then the next one allows you to zoom your camera. So you can pan, rotate, and zoom. But I also want to point out that you can do this by left clicking out here in open space to rotate. If you right click, you can zoom in and out. And if you middle mouse click, you can also pan your camera. But there's a problem that kind of comes in when you try to say you're using a tool that sculpts on your mesh. And let's say you want to rotate the camera, but for some reason you need to have the cursor over the model at the same time. So let me undo that. If you alt click, hold down your alt key and left click at the same time, hold down your alt key and left mouse click, you can actually rotate your camera that way while your cursor's over the model and you won't affect the model. If you keep the alt key pressed and use your right mouse button, then it will zoom and middle mouse will pan. And so what I do is I just get in the habit of holding down the alt key anytime I want to adjust the camera like that, rather than trying to worry about whether or not I'm just on the edge or outside of the model to rotate it. So that's a good habit to get in. There's a couple other things I want to point out is the fact that when you sculpt on something, there are hotkeys that are defined that allow you to do certain things. So like say in ZBrush, where you had, say, sculpted on something, you want to smooth it out, you can hold down the shift key. Well, the same thing occurs in 3D Code. In fact, if I hold down my shift key, you'll see that my cursor goes from red down here, red to green. And when I do, and then left click, it'll smooth it out. Now, if I basically hold down my control key, I don't get a smooth operation. I get an invert operation. Instead of pulling or sculpting out the shape, if I hold down control, it'll invert that shape. And of course, it's messing it up because we're getting so thin that it's causing these voxels to destroy. So let me back out of that for a second. If I control, I'll get a recession or a recede into the model. If I don't control, it'll pull it out. And it depends on the tool. Some tools are meant to cut into it. So all control is doing is it's clicking or toggling this invert action up here. Now you won't necessarily see it because I'm pressing control, but it's still happening. And smooth, of course, dictates how smooth this operation is occurring, but it's not this kind of smoothing up here. This smoothing basically dictates as the tool is occurring. In other words, I'm pulling out my shape, how much smoothing is happening at the same time. That is not to be confused with the smooth tool itself, okay? In the smooth tool, you notice that it doesn't have a hotkey assigned to it, which we just said if you press shift, it occurs. That's because that functionality is built in as a overall smoothing action, either in the paint room or the voxel room or whatever. But keep in mind that you can define hotkeys for just about anything over here in the tools menu. So let's say I want a hotkey for build up. I'll click on build up and it says end define hotkey. So I'm going to press the end key and then I'm going to press a hotkey. So if our tool is build up, maybe shift B is my hotkey. So now if I float over build up, you'll see at the bottom of this little pop-up window, it says shift B and then backspace to delete the hotkey. So if I press shift, if I go to say another tool and I pressed shift B, I'm now in build up. And then I can use that tool as I see fit. If I don't want that hotkey, I'll press backspace, and it will put it back to where it was. So the one thing I definitely go through and use as a hotkey is this smooth all operation. I use it often. So in this case, I'll press end, shift S, or whatever hotkey I want. But in this case, I press shift S. And what that does is it smooths, if I press shift S, it brings up the pop-up options for smooth all as if I had pressed the smooth all toolbox. or tool. And then I can adjust these as I see fit. Now, if you aren't getting that option, it's because you're in voxel mode. So let me click on this S, and it takes me to voxel mode versus surface mode. We'll go into more detail about this later. But voxel mode has a different set of tools, but one common tool between surface and voxel mode is the smooth all operation. But in this case, if I were to smooth all, let me get rid of the gizmo there. If I do smooth all, and it's defined as Shift S here as well, based on what I had done, I keep smoothing it, these hard edges become softer. If I go into surface mode and press Shift S, I actually have an option, further options I can do based on the surface mode's smooth all operation. So it's all contextually driven. Okay, the other thing I want to point out is that I'm able to go up and down in this tools palette by left clicking and dragging, or I can use my scroll wheel. Scroll down, scroll up, and you can see it works both in the shaders, and you don't have to click over here. You can literally just float your cursor over it, and if there's anything to be seen that's out of view, you can use your scroll wheel or just left click and drag it. Or you have these little arrows down here at the bottom or the top. If there's anything cut off, you can use them. Now, if for some reason your tools area here looks different and you're in the voxel room, you can click on this T. It says change UI look. So you can click on it, click on it, click on it, click on it, and you'll see that you get different options to represent these tools over here. The other thing I want to point out is if you want to get to the tools quickly, you can also press the space bar. And the space bar gives you this quick access. And so you can float over these to get to the same tools you could on the left-hand side. And if for some reason you needed that to stay into place, you could just click on this little pin icon, drag it to where you want, and it'll stay up as you work. Although I don't typically use that. Now, there's also menu options under some of these palettes. And when I say under, I actually mean to the side, but they are based on these menu palettes. So if I want to adjust brushes in a different way than just adding a new one just by clicking on new, I can click on this little arrow icon if it exists, and I can organize my brushes into folders. I can even change the icons and how big or small they are so I can see, or in this case, not see, what is there as an option. So if there is if there's not an arrow over here, it means that there are no further things that you can do with what's in this palette using that arrow, because there isn't one. So the other thing I'm going to point out is this little squiggly over here. Now this is what we call the E palette, or the E panel, I'm sorry. And the reason it's called the E panel is if you press the E key, it comes up. So you don't actually have to float over here to this or click on it. You can click on E and it comes up. And it gives you a way to adjust things like whether I'm going to draw with a square, or if I press E again and click on this, I can literally just paint as if I'm using a paintbrush, or if I want to use splines or what have you. If I want to ignore or affect faces behind the ones I'm using, I can use this tool, these tools, and these options might change based on what it is I have selected, etc. So that's a way to control the viewport. That's a way to maneuver up and down in areas that you couldn't otherwise see in palettes or tools panels, etc. But you can also adjust the layout of these tools and these palettes just by simply left clicking and dragging them somewhere. And we talked about this a little bit in the UI introduction, but we'll go into more depth into how to tweak and customize your UI or user interface as you see fit. But I just wanted you to see that if for some reason you're not seeing something, you can always go to Windows, pop-ups, and find it, and then drag it in or leave it sitting there floating, and it will be there as you go into that room. Now, if I go to a different room, it disappears. If I go back to Voxel, you'll see it appears again. And in fact, I actually go to the Retopo room and I put my Vox tree in there. So I can have it both in the Voxel room and in here. So I can toggle voxels on and off as I see fit. So basically that's the controls. We've talked about how to alt drag with your left mouse button to rotate, right button to zoom, middle mouse button to pan, and the fact that holding down that alt key to do that, no matter whether your cursor is floating over the object that you don't want to affect, but you want to rotate the camera view, etc., is important. So get in the habit of using that Alt key to adjust the camera views. Otherwise, let it go and just use your Alt key, your middle left mouse or other mouse buttons as you see fit. The Control key will invert, and we can adjust different things in the user interface and where they're at. The other thing I want to cover is selections. Tool selections is as simple as left-clicking the tool. Now, some tools, as I pointed out earlier, will bring up options, further options that you can select just by toggling with the left mouse button these options on and off. Or in this case, where if I float over the smoothing degree, left-click and drag right or left, I can adjust the smoothing as I see fit. I can even click one time in that box and type in the value that I want, assuming that my number pad is on. I can do that. The same thing for renaming layers. And these are layers that this is sitting on. This is a layer, volume 451. The root you cannot mess with, but if you double click on that layer, you can name it as something more descriptive like cube. And I'll go into more depth on the voxel tree or vox tree later on, but that's one way to deal with the layer naming, and the same thing for anything else that you might want to name. The other thing you can do is drag these layers up and down in the hierarchy of things. And it's not so much a hierarchy because none of these right now are a child of anything except the root layer, which is always there anyway. But if for some reason they were, then that would be a hierarchy. This is more layer ordering, so to speak, and it's mainly for visual purposes. And one thing I want to point out also that is that if I have my layer selected, this object becomes a lighter color. If I select another layer, it becomes a darker color. So if I have more than one object on the scene, which I'll do right now, let's say I put another cube on the scene, and I'll hit enter just to place it. And let's say I, at this point, want to flip between, I'll just go to another tool to get that out of the way. If I want to flip between these, I can, and you'll see that they highlight based on which one I have selected. Now, if you have a lot of objects on your scene in different layers, it might be hard to figure out what layer they belong to. So that's another thing I want to show is how to select using a hotkey. If you float your cursor over the object you want to affect and press H, it will select that object and its containing layer. H, H, H. And all I'm doing is floating my cursor over and pressing H. I'm not even pressing the mouse button. But I can, in some cases, click on an object. Let me bring up another sort of object to work with here. And this is called the mannequin. We won't go in depth on this one, but if I click, let's say I go to the transform tool. In fact, I probably could have done it with the cubes, but in this case, I'm going to use the transform tool. If the transform tool, which allows me to adjust the scale, either uniform scale or axial scale, or scale on an axis, or rotation, which is view dependent, depends on which view I'm in, or I can use these rotators at the end of each axis to do. This transform tool allows me to manipulate my objects. But what if I want to select another object? Now, obviously, we said we could press H and get there. Now, if it's on a separate layer, that'll work. If it's not, that won't necessarily work. But, I mean, it'll work. It'll just select this whole thing if it's all in one layer. But rather than just pressing H and selecting it, the other thing I can do is with my transform tool selected, I can left click on the objects that I want to affect with the transform tool. So some tools allow you to do that just by simply clicking on what you want, and it adjusts to the correct layer as well. So that's really neat. Now, as far as the ePanel selections, I showed you that by pressing E, but you can also use the ePanel. Again, let me start with a new object on the scene. Start with our cube again. Press enter to commit it to the scene, because what we started with was what's called a proxy. Essentially, it's non-existent on the screen until I press enter or apply it to the screen. But so I'm going to work with this cube, and let's say I want to select a certain area to affect. So I want to do an extrusion, and if I paint with the extrusion, you'll see I can do that. But let's say I want to paint along a spline. Then I can literally grab, say, a tool that's a spline tool off the ePanel, and just select one, and click click, 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 click. And when I'm done, and you'll see this little arrow, just it's kind of annoying sometimes, but it basically pops up beside your splines as you're working with them, and it'll give you options. And so in this case, I'm going to say edit points just to get it to stop dragging a line wherever my cursor goes. And then I can just press enter, and it will do my stroke along that spline. If I undo that and just press Control Enter, remember Control is an inversion. Instead of pulling the shape out, it inverts it into the box. So let's do that again. Enter pulls it out of the box. You can see it's sticking out. In fact, let me give it a little more strength by right-clicking and dragging up, and then hit Enter. So I have this sticking out of the box. Or if I press Control Enter, it digs it into the box. And it's just an inversion of whatever that tool is supposed to do. So that Control Enter will do that. Now, if I want to move my spline, I can hold down my space key and move this around and then do it again, use it again. If I want to press enter, I can do that. And it should affect my, it took a second, but it should affect my sculpture there. So in this can take, it can have a little bit of a delay based on the memory of your computer and the power of it and that kind of thing when you're trying to do certain operations. The other thing I want to point out, and I forgot to mention this, is that if you're using a Mac, your control key, if I remember correctly, is your command key, and I want to say your option key is your alt key. I have a Mac, but I don't use this on the Mac very often, so forgive me if I don't remember all of it, but you'll get the gist of it. It's the Mac equivalent of the controls that I am pressing or using. Okay? So that's controls and selections. I guess the thing I want to point out is that understanding controls and selections and practicing with them, especially when it comes to navigating your viewport, is critical. You really want to get used to this and familiar with this before you do anything else, because you're going to use these techniques in every single room. And when I say room, it's these tabs at the top. Every single room that you're in, you're going to use these to some degree, one way or another. So I highly recommend practicing with this before moving forward.